This video will review the diagnostic process from the generation of the hypothesis and the testing of that hypothesis by the patient's signs and symptoms. That is hypothetic abduction or strip focus hypothetic abduction, coming up with a provisional diagnosis and then correcting that for bias and error, giving you the working diagnosis from which you make a treatment plan and a prognosis. And then you can constantly review the diagnosis in light of the results of the treatment. So if this is not matching your expectations, the prognosis is not being met, then you have to review the diagnosis and the treatment, because one of these things isn't working. Either you've got the wrong diagnosis or you've got the right diagnosis and the wrong treatment and you're applying it incorrectly, or you've got the right diagnosis, the wrong treatment, and you're applying that treatment correctly. Either way, the diagnosis or the treatment and all the treatment needs to be changed. So this whole process takes from the H1 generation through the final treatments. And in fact, your diagnosis isn't the final diagnosis until your treatment matches the diagnosis. So we'll be following that process along. It's a fairly short video. Review it critically, please. This is an algorithm. An algorithm is a step-by-step instruction to a computer to execute its program. This is not what I intend here at all. For me, this is a teaching aid, and hopefully for you, a learning aid. Please don't use this as a series of steps for you to follow with every patient. What I'd like you to do is understand the process, and for the most part, you'll do most of this, but you're probably not doing it consciously. I'd like you to be aware of the process you're using. For most conditions, you can do this unconsciously. You'll go through it. But for the more complicated ones, you're going to really have to think about what you're doing. So, as I say, it's not a slavish thing. Just understand it, criticize it, redo it, see where if I've missed anything out, if I put too much in, understand it. So you start off with generating H1. You test H1 with hypothetic abduction or strip focus abduction. That is, you're testing your hypothesis with the patient's signs and symptoms, either an extended series of signs and symptoms or an abbreviated one, such as the essential illness script. If H1 fails that, then generate H2, and if that fails, H3, all the way through HN. If H2 through N fails, that is, none of your hypotheses are working, then you have to simply review and redo the examination. You've messed up somewhere or another. Or, this isn't within your knowledge area, and you've never come across this before, possibly because it's completely outside of our field. Or simply it's a matter of experience or lack thereof. If the examination redo doesn't work out for you, that is, the signs and symptoms misfit the hypothesis, then refer it out for a second opinion. If the hypothesis stands up to testing, then your hypothesis becomes a provisional diagnosis, and it has to be tested for bias and error. The bias is basically availability bias with differential diagnosis for the availability, and then the confirmation bias, which is going to be the follow-up big one for this. Repeat back the patient's answers to the patient and see if they agree that's actually what they said. You can twist things around so you make their answer fit, and make sure the patient has actually said that. You also need to talk about your interpretation of the patient's answer. Now, this isn't telling the patient what you think the problem is. This is a matter of talking to the patient about how you're interpreting their answers and the results of their test. Now, if they disagree with your interpretation, it doesn't mean to say that you're wrong, that the hypothesis is incorrect. They haven't got the knowledge or the experience to be able to do that, but it will make you think very carefully about what your interpretation is if they don't agree with it, or it should do. Number 7, test the provisional diagnosis for error. This is you've made a mistake somewhere along the line. It's not about bias, it's just about a mistake. So this is usually about the physical test. So retest, be more careful, more thoughtful, and more deliberate in the way you're testing. Think about what the tests are actually supposed to be doing as opposed to what you think they're doing. If the bias error correction shows bias and or error, move on to the next hypothesis. If the bias error correction shows no bias or error, that provisional diagnosis now becomes your working diagnosis around which you can treat plan, but always review that diagnosis in the light of the results of treatment. That is, if the treatment is not reaching what you expected it to do, either the diagnosis is wrong or the treatment is wrong and you're doing it right, or the treatment's right and you're doing it wrong. Either way, it's either the diagnosis or the treatment that's not doing what it's supposed to do. Continuous review of that diagnosis will stop that happening, and it will stop you from treating the patient over and over and over again, basically with the same treatment or slight modifications thereof. Be critical in what you're seeing. Okay, this is a flowchart, which is a sort of a diagrammatic view of that last algorithm. Hopefully I've included what I've said in the algorithm. Again though, your job is to look at this and see if I have, or if there's stuff I've left out, or if there's stuff I could have included. Again though, it's about understanding the process, and some people will learn better with a diagram, other people will learn with this. So we're going to generate H1. You then test H1 with the patient's signs and symptoms, again in extended form or in abbreviated form with the essential illness script. If H1 is a misfit, generate H2 through N as needed. If HN then fits, you now have your provisional diagnosis. If H1 fits immediately, then you have your provisional diagnosis. Now, if you generated H1 by a negative differential diagnosis, then this now becomes your diagnosis, because there's no need to check for bias. You've already done that for the most part. Although you might want to think about errors here. So if this wasn't done through differential diagnosis, or H1 was the first one that you came to and it's correct, the more hypotheses you go through, the less likely there is to be bias and error. But let's assume it's the first one off, it's H1 or H2, then bias error correction for bias. Availability bias is attacked with differential diagnosis, preferably negative differential diagnosis would be my suggestion. Confirmation bias, again by repeating answers and reporting your interpretation to the patient. For error, retest again with more thought, more deliberation and more care. If the bias error correction then fails, generate HN. If you cannot generate another hypothesis, out for a second opinion. If the bias error correction is good, then your provisional diagnosis now becomes your diagnosis, and you consistently and continuously review that diagnosis with the treatment results. Now let's repeat ourselves for low back pain and right upper buttock pain. So let's say that your single hypothesis is biomechanical dysfunction. The bias now is availability bias, and you correct that bias with differential diagnosis after you've made that diagnosis, so not as you go along. The EIS fits, H1 becomes a provisional diagnosis, and on you go. So availability bias is corrected with differential diagnosis. Then you have to worry about confirmation bias. The bias correction for that is to repeat the answers back to the patient, and differential diagnosis for availability bias. If all this works out for you, H1 now becomes a provisional diagnosis. If bias error correction is good, that becomes your diagnosis. If bias error correction fails, that's your move on to your second and third and fourth hypothesis. The errors now can be corrected through misinterpreting the answers, which may be confirmation bias, or it may simply be that you're not listening properly, or poor testing. Test your interpretation on the patient, and then the physical tests are done and the questions are done with more deliberation. Okay, so it's exactly the same. There's no real difference here. Okay, that's your review. It's not difficult. It looks more complicated than it is. But once you get used to doing it, it becomes simpler, and it actually becomes automatic, which is really what pattern recognition is about. Possibly one of the more difficult aspects of this is actually looking at differential diagnosis. We've talked about this before. Basically, what you want to do is visualize the anatomy underneath the pain and the various pathologies in that area that could be causing that pain. If you go from superficial to deep, or deep to superficial, whichever is your preference, you'll go through each tissue in turn, and these will essentially become your differential diagnosis when you apply the pathology to them. It's not a big deal. There's always another pathology there, which is referral, and that is the pain isn't local. And this is going to be indicated by the fact you can't find anything local of significance. So the next difficult thing is generating the hypothesis. There's a reluctance to do so because you've been taught, so as you've all been taught, you shouldn't make a decision until all the information is in, and that's reasonably true, but all of the information that you need is focused on making the diagnosis, not everything about the patient. That will come into other aspects of the exam. So generally speaking, the essential illness script will be specific to the condition, or as specific as you're likely to get, and everything else that you ask or do will increase the sensitivity but decrease that specificity. So my recommendation is that you check your hypothesis with an essential illness script. And then it's simply a matter of understanding that's only a provisional diagnosis. It's provisional on there being no bias and error correction, or as little as possible. So you make sure that you do a bias error correction. When that's in place, you then have the diagnosis that you can now treatment plan on, and come up with a prognosis, and then you can check the diagnosis against the results of the treatment, that is the prognosis. And if they match, great, you're probably right in your diagnosis. If they don't match, something's wrong. So it's not a difficult process to go through, and it's one that everybody should be going through, consciously or unconsciously. Okay, so practice it, particularly the differential diagnosis and generating that first hypothesis, and being aware that you need to change your hypothesis when it's necessary. And that goes against the grain as well, because a lot of you have been taught that if you change, you failed. And the exact opposite is true. Okay, guys, take care.